My name is Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I come from Illinois State University. That's a university founded in 1857, and I represent the School of Communication, which is one of the largest units in the smaller College of Arts and Sciences. And there are nearly 900 students and 40 faculty in this School of Communication. I'm the Director of Convergent Media, which is a very unique position. Most of our students are in one of 4 different groups: Communication Studies, Mass Media, Journalism, Public Relations, or else are in our graduate program. And as you can see from this chart, about 1/3 are actually in Mass Media or Journalism, hopefully like you here in this room. And we have a number of student media organizations that students are part of. The first is a TV station called TV10 News. They run 3 days a week and 9 shows daily that are broadcast live and broadcast over the internet. We have a radio station run by students called WZND, and students there broadcast news, but also provide entertainment for the local community. And finally, we have a newspaper called the Daily Vidette that has been running continuously since the founding of the university. And that newspaper is now publishing primarily online. And I bring these media groups to mind because they are spaces that require particular attention, especially in these changing times. We're at a current moment known as media convergence. And it's probably something you have all heard of to some degree. And what we have found is that our different student media organizations need to be sharing resources. And so I put together a chart to hopefully demonstrate what that looks like and talk about how we've been thinking through this. So as you can see, there's overlap among each of these different media organizations. Our television station and newspaper frequently share resources related to video studios. Our newspaper is producing video as well as our TV station. Our radio station and television station are both producing online broadcasts. And finally, our newspaper and radio stations are sharing resources to help them with digital sales. They both need to be able to make money to actually support themselves, and the ability to have online platforms to sell advertising space has been very important. But even more importantly, at the center of this chart, you will see social media stand as the most important converged digital resource at this moment. And so with all of the sharing, what we've noticed is that there are some major problems that occur. As you can imagine, different media organizations have their own territory. They don't want to always share. They have their own funding, their own workflows. We found that media outlets cannot always share specialized equipment. Things that work for television stations aren't necessarily things that radio operators know how to work with. And then finally, we've been finding that faculty are not necessarily able to always teach outside their specialization area. So at Illinois State, again, we've been finding that we need to be sharing these resources. And one of the solutions to providing convergence are spaces that we call convergence labs. Since I arrived at Illinois State in 2013, we've created 2 entirely new labs to support the learning and teaching in our School of Communication. The first that I will only talk briefly about is our Communication Innovation Center, which we created in 2017, so fairly recently. And then the second, and the one that I will spend most of the time talking about today, is our Social Media Analytics Command Center. So first, and really briefly, our Communication Innovation Center is set up as a space to share resources among our radio and television and newspaper students. And it provides resources such as a shared media server where they can host video and a large amount of video that can be shared very quickly among the computers in that space. They have a group studio where they can edit. There's a green screen studio in the very back corner, so that students who want to produce their own newscasts can actually go back to that center and set up lighting and camera equipment to produce a newscast on the fly, apart from the TV station. And we also have a number of other studios that allow for color correction, surround sound, and other work with audio. And finally, we realize the importance of students having access to equipment, and we provide cameras that they can check out beyond their work in the TV station or the radio studios. And here's some other views really briefly, just to see students in action. And I apologize for those of you at the back. I'm sorry that you won't be able to see everything up close. But do feel free to come forward at the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to show. Our second space is the Social Media Analytics Command Center. And this has been providing probably the most important kinds of convergence, again, through the study of social media. We do several different kinds of things in this space, and the space is really supported through these technologies. First, we work with what are called social media listening and monitoring software. We use two products called Nuvi and Meltwater, and I will demonstrate what those look like shortly. But those have been very important because they are what allow us to collect and understand and analyze and visualize data sets. Second, in this space, we actually have a large wall that displays live cable TV feeds from news sources around the United States and the world. We also have a large video wall there that is set up for consultation work, so that when we do social media analytics, we are often doing it for clients who may be partners in the community, and in some cases paying clients, those who may have contracts with the university. And finally, we also have mobile stations. These are stations that are touch screens and that can be moved around to different places on the university. So that as we have events such as political debates, or if we have maybe athletics events, we can actually broadcast and demonstrate the social media conversations connected with those events in real time and have students engage with those. And here's a quick view of that space again. I will hopefully show other views, and again, for those of you at the back, I apologize. You will be able to come up and see some of those later. So let me now talk about how we've been conducting social media analytics education. I will do this in a couple of ways. First, I will talk about some of the primary tools. I will talk about our approaches, as well as share links to tools that we have been using. So in some ways, this will be as practical as it will be exploratory as we walk through these different ideas. So first, inside our Social Media Analytics Command Center, or else we call it SMAC for short, we do social media monitoring and analysis. And what this means is we have tools that can collect data from public Facebook pages, Twitter, Instagram, blog sources, online news sources, aggregate that, bring it together so that we can understand trends very quickly and in real time. We also do a considerable amount of work doing social media strategy and development. So all of our different student media groups, from the radio station to the television station to the newspaper, spend a lot of time publishing to the social web. In fact, our newspaper right now, and this is an American thing, but they publish to Twitter almost more than they do in a print newspaper. And so they have to understand the impact of what they produce. And developing a social media strategy is central to that. And our space helps support that. And finally, in addition to supporting our students in the media operations, these kinds of spaces provide us the opportunities to do what we call big data research. We have the capacity to collect, and I'm not kidding here, millions of tweets and to analyze them all at once. And I know Georgia's not a big Twitter place, but that's okay. There are other kinds of social media that we can collect large data sets from. So let me go through and talk about some of the different kinds of trends and the ways that we think about trends and how we might study those trends. And I hope this is exploratory. I hope this plants seeds in your mind of things that you might explore and try and do. And of course, there will be time for questions afterwards about some of these tools and ways that we might work with them and teach with them. So first, we recognize that there are trends that are what we might call user trends, where people need to know how many people are using social media sources. Who are they? Where are they from? What kinds of social media platforms are being used? And in our lab, we use two primary sources, one of which is actually a research center called the Pew Internet Research Center. It primarily focuses on US trends and US social media users, but they have been branching out to global trends. And I would love to see someday Georgians create a similar center to do this kind of research. And the second source that I will also showcase here in a moment is called StatCounter. And it will actually provide us global trends of different countries and the social media platforms that they use. So the first example that we'll see here are actually studies from the Pew Internet Research Center. And this is something that I have my students regularly read about, and that we have our students at Illinois State regularly read on as part of their classes. So for example, the Pew Center provides updates every year as to how many different people are using different platforms online. So for example, this just shows us the dominance of Facebook and YouTube and Instagram in the United States. Similarly, they will provide research that shows that Facebook users are still dominant, but we can see other sources that emerge as important. And what I think is important to realize with a source like the Pew Internet Research Center is that they combine traditional as well as new forms of research. They don't always have to rely just on social media data. They don't have to collect millions of tweets to understand what's happening. They can actually do the traditional process of interviewing people to find out what they use. And they're very good at this process, and they have pretty much perfected the ability to interview Americans and find out these trends. The next source that we use frequently is called StatCounter. And it actually uses big data trends and website traffic to determine the same thing. And so earlier, before I came to this trip, I did a search just for Georgia and discovered pretty quickly that you are indeed a Facebook kind of country. And so we can see that top line is nothing but Facebook. But this is a very valuable tool for any of you, especially students. You might be thinking about your prospective audiences for social media. And if you are branching out into international audiences and doing international broadcast and social media development, a tool like this can help you very quickly figure out what the dominant social media platforms are. Now, in addition to thinking about trends and what users are doing, we also want to know what kinds of trends there are in terms of content. And so we often use these tools for research into content trends. I'll showcase each one of these in a moment, but students in the United States especially are very interested in memes. And there's a wonderful site, it's almost the Wikipedia of memes, called Know Your Meme, that allows you to research different memes and when they have begun, who created them, and sometimes if the joke is very obscure, they will help explain that so you can understand what's happening. For Twitter, and again I apologize, I did not know Georgia does not use as much Twitter as I thought they did. But there are two sources that are amazing for understanding Twitter trends. One will show us trends over a 24-hour period and update them over real time. And the second will show us where trends are occurring on a map. So let me showcase these very, very quickly. And again, these are things that you can explore. And I will share this presentation so that you can see the links and visit them later. But something like Know Your Meme allows us to search, and it allows us to search by memes that may be trending, trends that are maybe important for us to know as we consider the kinds of content that we wish to produce, or even the kinds of content that we need to be critiquing and that we might see problematic. A site like Trends24 provides us hour-by-hour updates. And so in this case, this was worldwide trends. And we can see what the top keywords or hashtags or other content that's being produced. And it will provide a 24-hour range of all of that information. And it also allows it the ability to sort by not just worldwide locations. We can also go down in many cases to citywide levels if there are enough Twitter users in those locations. And similarly, TrendsMap also will allow you to search for different topics that are being discussed, but it will do it at a country and even city level. And it actually provides a map where you can see those words emerge. So as students here, I highly encourage you to start exploring what the rest of the world discusses and what they talk about. Learn about those trends. Learn about what it is that matters and what also unites us. In many cases, we see the same trends emerge across the globe, and that can be a fascinating moment. So those were some examples of ways that we can study content trends. And here are now some ways to think about regional influencer trends. I think that might be the hot word for, or the hot topic for many students nowadays. I just need more influencers, or I want to be an influencer, right? And studying who is influential and why can be accomplished through several different kinds of tools. The first is called Clear, which is actually a paid subscription, but it does provide some free tools that you can explore. You can search by different cities and different countries and find out who top users are in different spaces. There's another website called Social Bakers, which is actually very good for looking at Facebook trends. And what I appreciate about it is that you can also see different pages that may be increasing in volume of followers, and you can sort it by industry. And especially interesting is looking at the news and information industries right now, and looking at that relationship between Facebook and news, and especially misinformation, as I'm sure you are very aware of. And finally, for those of you who do investigative reporting, it may be important to understand how some influencers are creating advertisements, particularly political advertisements. And there's a vital tool that Facebook provides right now called the Facebook Advertising Library that allows you to search by page or by social issue or political issue. And it will show you ads, and it will show you who those ads have been delivered to, how much someone paid for those ads, and demographics of the Facebook user group that it was delivered to. So here's a quick overview of those again. Clear, and again, I'm sorry people at the back of the room, it's a little tiny today. But you get a breakdown of at least the top 10 influencers in certain locations. And it will show you all of the different social media channels that they use and the number of followers that they have access to. Again, as I mentioned before, Social Bakers, a very important tool that allows you to see who has the largest audiences in different locations, whose pages are growing the most quickly. And again, that can be extremely important for understanding the social media environment at the given moment. So consider these as research tools that can assist you. And finally, I do want to continue to emphasize this Facebook Advertising Library. One of the unfortunate things that has happened over the past year is that Facebook has revoked access to data for outside researchers. It is currently extremely difficult for academics and journalists to get into primary sources of Facebook data. One thing that Facebook did provide as a concession is the ability to search through ads. And so here's an example again. One of the things I did before coming on this trip was I searched for the keyword Ossetia, just to see, again, what kinds of ads may be produced. And you can sort by country and region. And so this was an example of an ad that was created to target residents of Tbilisi. And I don't know much about this source, but I can see that it reached fewer than 1,000 people, and whoever created it, I think, only spent about $100 US. But what is so important is to see how these ads are created and who they are targeting, so that you can better understand who may be attempting to influence politics. Finally, when I mentioned the ability to do research with big data, here are several of those sources, and I hope to share many of these with you to encourage you to start thinking about how you might use these to help you down the road as you do your own research. So the two that I've already mentioned, Nuvie and Meltwater, are what we would call enterprise or industry tools that require very large-scale subscriptions. And that's something that we've been fortunate enough in our labs that we've been able to support through financial donations and through the client work that we've done in our labs. Nuvie is a source that allows us to analyze social media posts in real time. It allows us to search by keywords or by screen names, and we can again collect those posts in real time and start to understand the analytics and trends and user demographics very quickly. Meltwater is very similar, and as we'll see here though, the difference is that rather than doing real-time analysis, it is actually a company that saves data and saves sources from different social media and legacy media sources, and allows us to look through that archive and analyze that for trends as well, so that we might see what was happening 6 months ago in different social media platforms. And then finally, one of the things that we are increasingly encouraging our students to do is to learn computer programming. And communication students and media students, at least at my university, always tell me that they got involved in communication because they hate math and they hate computers. And I have to laugh because when I start to teach them programming, they really enjoy it because they have power. They have the ability to define the terms of their research projects. So some of the things that we've been teaching are the R, statistical programming language, and Python, that allow these students to directly connect to Twitter, to Reddit, to YouTube, and several other sources to collect that data so that they may analyze it themselves and to do it in much more depth than they would otherwise be able to. And one of the top tools that we've been using for this Twitter analysis is called RTweet. And I'll give a sense of what that looks like in a moment. So, as I mentioned with Nuvi, it is a subscription service that provides real-time keyword searches. I think what is important to know is that many of these tools only allow us to acquire what is publicly available on the social web. So that means accounts that are protected or accounts that are posted through, again, Facebook are very limited in terms of what we can see publicly. And that said, though, as we collect and analyze, a tool like Nuvi can do a number of things for us. It can analyze the text, so we can look for trends in terms of keywords, in terms of ideas or concepts that are being discussed. But it will also look for opinions. So it will look through what we call sentiment, where it will look for keywords by means of whether they are positive or negative emotions being expressed. And that can be very valuable for understanding a larger audience reception to a particular idea or topic. And finally, the service allows the ability to analyze audiences. It will give us a sense of how many people are talking about a topic and how many followers they have. And so, in the end, how many people may have seen this topic. And here's an example of what the software allows us to see. And again, sorry, people at the back, I apologize. But this example here is actually a timeline. And you can see all of these circles and bubbles is a post that we have collected. And in this case, we're analyzing just conversations about Illinois State University. And we can see them on a timeline. The bigger the circle, the more influential that social media user might be. And the colors correspond with the emotional tone. So positive emotions are green, negative emotions are red. And this becomes incredibly valuable for students who are studying, again, let's say, public relations at our university, or who may be journalists studying an issue or an incident or a protest on campus, for example. They can very quickly see the community response that's emerging in the social web. And students will look at this in real time. They can learn from it. We have classes that will teach how to read these kinds of software. Here's another view from this platform. It allows us to see audience metrics. So you can see there's a small blue box and a large green box. That shows us how many people are seeing or potentially seeing posts and how many are seeing them by means of shares. And in this case, we're seeing that there are hundreds of thousands of potential audience members by means of all of these posts. We also get breakdowns in terms of who's talking about these topics, how often they're talking about these topics, and whether or not they matter, because we can see that they may be influential or not. As I mentioned earlier, Meltwater is another tool that we've been working with. It's a company based, I believe, in Finland, and they are a media subscription, or apologies, they're a media intelligence service. And what they provide is the ability, again, to search through their databases to get a sense of what has been said so that we can understand more about it. They, too, also provide access to public social media sources. So we can look at Twitter, Facebook pages, blogs, Reddit, other online sources. And just like Nuvi, it conducts analysis of text, sentiment, overall trends, audience analysis. And here's an example of one of the dashboards that one of my students created with this tool. And one of the searches we did for this is the word impeach. And I can't imagine why that's important right now. And what you can see right here is that there is very, very negative emotions expressed. Right? If you can see all those red lines, immense amounts of negativity. And we can also see where, for those of you up at the front of the room, you can see a map, and it's a heat map, and you can see where the word impeach is being used frequently. So there should be no surprises, right? And finally, we can see things like the keyword that is coming up the most often with the word impeach, which I think is Trump, for those of you who can't see back there. But this becomes then a tool, of course, for analysis, for understanding, again, what is motivating people, for how they are responding, what they are talking about in relationship to different topics. Now, finally, the other tool that I mentioned, R-Tweet, again, for doing this big data analysis. It is a tool that is created for use with the R statistical programming language. What I appreciate about it is that it is free. Anyone can download it and access it for free. And it is a wonderful educational tool because it allows you to write code to directly work with some social media platforms to collect and analyze their data. And I apologize for this being small again, but here's an example of what my students will frequently learn to do. They learn how to set up these different searches, how to write code to collect data, and then write code to examine that data. And for example, I just looked at the hashtag Tbilisi before I left on my trip, and you can see here are the keywords, probably no surprise here, that were coming up as the most frequently used hashtags. Now, it frequently, apologies, yeah. Okay. Now, it frequently is asked, how does this matter for students? And why do these spaces matter? And I think the most important is that these directly connect the classroom and careers. So this kind of training in social media monitoring and analysis and these analytics tools, these are frequently being used in industries, from public relations to journalism to strategic communication, again, for researching the social web and starting to understand audiences. So that direct training puts our students at an immense advantage when they are on the work, when they are searching for their jobs. Second, I love these tools in our spaces because it forces our students to change their mindsets. It requires them to think differently about research, to think differently about what they might report and how they do that reporting, and they develop stronger analysis skills through these tools and by doing social media analytics. And finally, the projects that they create encourage these very direct application of skills, and in many cases are extremely useful for the communities around them. One of the things that I often do is connect my students with partners in industry. These could be small businesses, these could be other offices in the university, really anyone for whom social media is an important part of their communication strategy. And these students can do research projects, provide reports, and in some cases even guide the overall strategy. So it provides excellent hands-on training. And here are some very specific examples. So first, we've had television journalists coming out of our School of Communication that have used our Social Media Analytics Command Center to tell the news in a very different way. So as I mentioned earlier, we frequently study our own university, which is a fairly large university with 20,000 students. And there's a lot of coverage of different events and ideas that are discussed in the social web. And so we had students that figured out that they could actually use this tool live on TV, almost like a weathercast. And they're all touch screens. And so they could walk through and say, look, here's an incident, a protest, or a problem that happened on campus. Let's look at it in further detail. And so this became part of a TV show that they called The Bottom Line. And the two students who started that immediately had jobs in Virginia and North Carolina after they left school because of their ability to create and work with a show like this, and very creatively integrated into their storytelling. I also have a series of interns that work directly with me on projects for different clients, and they also are the people who help me develop new ideas. And students like this are wonderful for the way in which we can bounce ideas off of each other. And when we're learning to code and when we're learning to work with data, they're really my test subjects and guinea pigs for trying new things out. And what I appreciate about them is that they're willing to try very new things, and they're willing to try very difficult things. And so you can see here they're actually presenting a research poster at a university research symposium where they collected 3.4 million Facebook comments and analyzed them according to sentiment and the tone of voice. And what they discovered is that larger states had much more negative interactions on Facebook, which was very interesting. And unfortunately, this is a study that can no longer be done because, as I mentioned earlier, Facebook no longer provides access to researchers for these kinds of data sets. But that doesn't mean that the research stops. We now work with other sources, and we have learned ways to collect data by means of Instagram and web scraping, and by means of what we've just looked at in terms of R and R-Tweet. Another example of students who have been making excellent use of this space is an organization called the Innovation Consulting Community. And this is a set of students who volunteer, and they are paired up with national level organizations, such as athletics teams, such as major brands and agencies, and products, and national companies. And they use the space to do research and behind-the-scenes analysis by collecting, let's say, the social media posts from the competitors of a number of companies. And they will analyze those and use that to kind of reconstruct a social media plan for their clients. I've also had students in this consulting community figure out ways to look at Twitter data and see if that affects the stock market. And so they've been very innovative in thinking about how social media data might be used in very different ways. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about two areas that are important. I think first, of course, are ethical issues that we require our students to be thinking about in our social media lab. I think first and foremost, and this goes with anyone doing work with data and visual representation, but that is that data are very easy to misrepresent. I often prefer to teach students coding over teaching them how to use platforms like Nuvie and Meltwater, because they often fall into the trap thinking that these beautiful analytics tools tell me the whole picture, and I don't need to do any work. Right? And that's something that we have to teach through, and we have to teach students to be much more critical and examine them in much more depth. I think a second ethical issue that we deal with regularly is that social media are very prone to trends. And trends are something that focus on the popular, but not necessarily the things that are the most important. And so we have to really teach our students to look at social media data in much more depth than simply what is popular, what is trending. And then finally, one of the things that we also have to teach is the idea that data is coming from people, right? All of these posts, especially these Facebook posts and Twitter posts, they're coming from everyday people like you and me, and we have to protect their rights in many ways. So students have to be trained in what they do after the data are done, after we've completed a project. Do we delete that data? Or how do we hide the screen names of people when we publish our data sets? So those are all very important ethical issues for us. And as I've suggested and mentioned already several times, there are major tensions and problems right now in analytics. It is a changing field. It's a rewarding field, but there is a lot that we must do to keep up with. So first, one of the most significant things that has happened over the past year is that Facebook and Instagram have essentially cut off access to primary data. This morning, in conversation with your rector, this came up as a major concern, especially for journalism and democracy, because as Facebook is focusing more and more on political advertising, there is no one to check on what is going on. We are losing checks and balances. And so this loss is hopefully something that will unite universities around the world and around the globe to pressure these organizations that we may, again, have access to these data sets and learn about what is going on in these spaces. A second problem that has been happening, especially for American universities, is that we've been over-relying on Twitter data because it is very easy to access that data, and there is so much of it. It is abundant data, and it's very easy and convenient. However, it is not representative of our larger populations. So anytime we produce studies and reports, we do find that they become limiting after a while. And we do have to account for those limits. And finally, when we study trends, and when we study the social web, we've often found that there is very bad behavior that occurs. And we can unintentionally amplify that bad behavior by putting a spotlight on it and having more people see it. And that's something we often want to not participate in if we can at all help it. Now, one last thing I'd like to discuss, I think I've already highlighted many of these things in our classes that use our labs and that do this work with social media analytics, is that we are really focusing on ways to develop critical thinking. And the first area that I think we do very good work in is that we are helping our students learn to balance different forms of of communication research methods. Especially when we think about our journalists and when we think about our researchers. They are now at a place where they have to combine old and new means of doing this research. At the very beginning, I talked about the Pew Internet Research Center and how that they don't necessarily have to go and collect really large data sets to understand who is online and who is using which social media sources. They just did a survey, a very complex survey, but it's a very traditional way of learning about an audience. And I think that's a good example of that balance between old and new. Second, I think any of this work, any student who comes through my lab and experiences the analytics software and participates in a project learns very quickly that they need to further evaluate news and information sources. Unfortunately, we may be getting to the point, especially in the United States, where everything starts to feel like fake news, and our students are probably too skeptical now. However, that doesn't mean that we should not continue that project of analysis and evaluation. And finally, what I appreciate about our lab and the Social Media Command Center is that it allows our students to develop much stronger data and information literacy skills. Because they're collecting their own data, because they have to understand the parameters that went into finding the sources and the volume of media that they were collecting data from, they're much more likely to be involved in that process and can understand it holistically. Now at this point, my presentation has come to a close, and I hope I've given you a sense of what has been happening at Illinois State University. I'd like to open it up for questions, but also concerns and ideas that you may have as well, because I think this is a wonderful moment to share not only ideas, but also experiences that I may be able to comment on. And I thank you very much for having me today.